Yeah. Detailed.
I called them today. They said 4 to 5 weeks from closing date, and I realized only two of the
Questions are always good.
Okay, I'm going to ask something very difficult for everybody.
Oh, you know.
It can be very challenging.
Yes.
The request is that the Blackberries, the smartphones, are put away. Although it's very, very intriguing, and we're all very curious to know what's happening right now with the elections. For 1 hour, just to
Talk
focus.
fast.
He's going to be there for 4 years, so.
This election will determine what happens in the Supreme Court. Big time.
Oh, you start?
Which could affect the laws in this country for the next 50 years.
Okay, so we're up to number 3 in the 5-part series.
And no advertising in the middle.
We might have to make it after 6-part series the way we're going. But the first 2 sessions we've had together, we've spent somewhat more time on delving into what took place, the very initial parts of history, of Jewish history, and getting involved with the personalities a little bit more in depth. And the reason for that is, like we mentioned at the beginning of the very first lecture, is based on the idea of Maisa Ovo Simin Labanim, which means that what took place in the most initial stages in Jewish history in regards to the life of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and what they went through, and the earliest formation of the Jewish nation and their trials and tribulations and what they went through, that has a major impact on what's going to be in the future. So we've spent lots of time delving into those first 2 lectures, and we're right up to here. We spoke about the birth of Abraham, which on the secular calendar is about 1800 BCE. We spoke last time about Moses and the whole episode with the Exodus, the leaving of Egypt, which is around 1313 BCE. That's this indication here, and right next to it is, we said 50 days later, the experience of Mount Sinai, with the national revelation, the Jewish people having this communication with the creator of the universe. And that's where we left off last time. What exactly took place on that mountain? We spoke about the unique claim, the fact that 3 million people witnessed this amazing phenomenon, but we didn't actually get involved with what exactly happened. So, in a nutshell, the first part of that whole episode was 3 million people, approximately, have this connection, this national revelation with the creator of the universe. Very intense moment. We have a tradition that tells us they almost died. It was too much to take. Such a force of spirituality, their souls were just leaving their body. They had to grab them back in, so to speak. The day after, Moses goes up on the mountain, and he's there for 40 days. And it wasn't just a physical ascent, but it was a spiritual ascent. The way the Talmud refers to it was that he went up to Shemayim, he went to the heavens. It was a different experience. It was a different realm that he was in for 40 days. He comes back down, 40 days later. What does he have with him? So he has the 10 Commandments, the tablets of law. Are there more than 10 Commandments, or is 10 pretty much it? Be easy. 10 was it. But we know there's more than 10. How many are there altogether in the Torah? How many obligations are there? 613. The idea of 10 Commandments, why these particular 10? Because these are the most broad. These are the most general, categorically speaking. And all of the other ones, all of the other 613 obligations that we have, fall into one of those 10 categories. That's the basic idea of the 10 Commandments. But not to say they're more important, they're more crucial. All of the Torah is crucial, because ultimately it's all instructions for living. That was one thing he had. The second thing he had was the Torah itself. The Torah that we have, we go to a synagogue, we have the scroll. that Torah scroll, who authored that Torah scroll? Who was the one who wrote down those words? It was Moses. It was dictated to Moses by God. The perspective of the Jewish people is that every word, every letter of the Torah is of divine origin. It was the hand of Moses, but ultimately it was the direct instruction of the divine. And that's why when you learn Talmud, you see how much we're careful with why does the Torah add in this one word. It says the word ach. What is that teaching us? It doesn't seem to be needed. It has an extra hey or an extra yud. Everything is viewed from the perspective of this must be significant because this was authored by God, so to speak. So we had the Torah scroll as well. What was the third thing he had? It wasn't tangible. It was the oral Torah, which is the bulk, the majority of what he received during those 40 days. We have the Torah itself. The Torah itself is very cryptic. If you ever open up a translated version, and nowadays, thank God, we have decent translations in normal plain English, but even normal plain English, you'll read it, and you will not understand what's going on. It's very concise, and many times it's just very hard to know what the Torah is talking about. The oral Torah was the explanation that God gave to Moses. Each and every line of the Torah, each and every word, each and every letter, that was God's teaching of Moses. This is what it means. It was the explanation, not the interpretation, but the explanation of the written Torah itself. So for example, in the Torah it says that every male above 13 years old has the obligation to wear tefillin. Okay, what's tefillin? So the translation that has been used throughout the centuries is they're phylacteries. Phylacteries. Okay. What is that? What's a phylactery? We don't know what that is. The oral Torah is that when God was telling Moses, so to speak, write down this obligation that every male above 13 is obligated to put on tefillin, he explained to Moses what tefillin was. He understood what it was supposed to look like. He understood what it represents, the spiritual power behind tefillin. That's the oral Torah. Another example. Many times in the Torah it says that the Shabbos is a very special day, and therefore every Jew must refrain from creative activity on the day of Shabbos. Okay, what's creative activity? Can I think? Thinking is creative. Can I have a conversation? How do you define the terms? And ultimately that's what the oral Torah was. That was the bulk, that was the majority of the Torah. And really without that, the Torah scroll itself is a closed book. If you don't have the guidance, the instructions of the oral Torah, you really have no clue what the Torah is saying. So Moses comes down the mountain with these three things. A good example given by one of the great rabbis of the 1800s, Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. He says if you go to a lecture and the person's up there for an hour and a half and he's speaking and it's a beautiful lecture, and afterwards you approach him and you say, you know what? I loved it so much. Can I get your notes? I want to give your notes to my brother. He wasn't able to attend, but I want him to gain from it. He says, sure. Here's my notes. Take it home, you give it to your brother, he takes a look at it. Story of dog. Blue shirt. What does this mean? So you were there, you heard the lecture, so you can explain what these things mean. And for you, this is actually significant because it could be used as a reminder what he spoke about. But if I was never at the lecture, I never heard what the man said, or what the lady said, then getting the notes is pretty much worthless. That, says Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, is what the Torah is without the oral Torah. It's just the notes. Now the question that many people ask is, why was the oral Torah oral? What's the point? We have the Ten Commandments, the tablets. We have the Torah itself, which we're going to have for centuries to come. Why is there need for any oral body of work? Everything should be written down. It'd be a lot simpler that way. And perhaps less confusion. So one idea is that we have a tradition that God says to Moshe on the mountain. Moshe says to God, you know what? let's write down the oral Torah. A lot less for me to memorize. And God's response to Moshe was, we can't do that. Because in centuries from now, what's going to happen is that the Torah is going to be translated into Greek. And we'll speak about that in next week's class. That was a very pivotal time in Jewish history. It's going to be translated into Greek, and everybody will now have access to what the Torah is saying. So if we also have the oral Torah written down, and that will be translated as well, then everyone in the world will claim to have access, and the idea of having one nation truly being the bearers of the torch, truly being the teachers, will be lost. Everybody will assume, listen, we have it all here. We know what it's about. We don't need any teacher. The flaw with that is twofold. Number one is the point of oral Torah, the point of the Torah itself, is supposed to be vibrant. It's supposed to be energetic. It's supposed to be something that flows from generation to generation and applicable in every situation, in every place and time we find ourselves. If you write that down, what you're doing is you're really making it stagnant. By writing something down by definition, you're causing it to be, you're taking it from an eternal state, a state where it potentially could last forever, and you're bringing it into the present. For example, if you ever open the Talmud, so many times the Talmud will discuss a case of your ox destroying my ox. I don't have an ox. My grandfather didn't have an ox. What is the relevance of learning about these ideas, these archaic laws? Well, we would say you have to look through that. You have to look past the example. The goal is try to find the kernel, try to find the idea of the oral Torah. That's hard to do. Once we have it written down, once we have cases and descriptions that were to that time, which we'll get to what that time was, but it makes it that much harder for future generations to really understand the crux of it, the kernel, and be able to apply it to their lives. So that's why the initial plan was God told Moses, no, I have to deny your request. The oral Torah has to stay oral. And there's actually a prohibition that for all future generations, the oral Torah must never be written down. To have individuals have their own little notebooks, that's okay. And that's what happened. From generation to generation, Moses to Joshua to the elders, everyone took their own notes. But there wasn't supposed to be any central work that was the body of the oral Torah. These are the three things that took place in Mount Sinai. One last point in regards to the need for an oral tradition. You go to a doctor, and you've heard good things about this person, and my knee's been hurting for a long time, and I heard you're just wonderful and you really could help me out, and I ask you, what are your credentials? Where did you go to school? And you reply, well, the truth is I didn't really go to medical school, but you should know, don't be nervous, I read every textbook out there. Everything on this subject, I'm a great reader, I can read quickly and get a lot of information. I read all the information I need. You would probably say, thank you very much, have a nice day. I'm going to find a real doctor. Because just reading something is one level of understanding, but you have to have a teacher. You have to make it real. You have to have a back and forth. That's all part of the reason why God wanted to make the oral Torah oral and keep it oral. What happened at Mount Sinai as well was not just an academic experience. It wasn't just the information that we got, but it was a very powerful emotional and spiritual experience. We say that every single Jew was at Mount Sinai. And part of the understanding of what that means is that the impression that was left on the soul and the psyche of every Jew was so profound that even now, 3,300 years later, we were there on some level. That mark is engraved in our own neshama, in our own soul. So it was a spiritual experience, it was an emotional, uplifting experience. The Talmud tells us actually that the highest level we ever reached collectively as a nation was standing by that mountain, where Moses came to us and he said, we're about to receive the Torah, do you accept? And the nation responded in unison, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will understand. And within those words, we see two very powerful ideas. Number one is the fact that we were saying, we're not just going to do it robotically. I'm not just going to follow the instructions and do it because you said so, but I'm going to do it with an understanding. I'm going to try my hardest to delve into it and probe and examine what these ideas are. So I'm not just robotic in my engaging in Torah, but it's actually real, it's part of who I am. On a deeper level, when we said Nasa v'Nishma, we were saying, we'll do, even before we understand. We know, going into it, there's certain things that there's no way we're going to fully comprehend. It can't be. We're getting this source from the author of reality, something supernatural. I'm not going to understand everything, but our response was, we're going to do it, and as we do it, hopefully we'll gain more of an understanding. But there is a devotion, there is a commitment, there is a spiritual experience there that was never reached since that time in history. We got a glimpse of the purpose of life. We got a glimpse of that moment that the creation of the world was an act of love. We came to the realization on the highest level ever that God doesn't need us, like we spoke about last time. The only potential reason that we could ever comprehend for existing in the first place is an act of love. Our very existence is a gift. And the Torah itself, therefore, was the ultimate gift. And by us realizing that and appreciating that, that really created a love connection between the Jewish people and the creator of the universe. The whole entire book of the Tanakh, of Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, written by King Solomon, we'll get to him tonight. One of his masterful works is the Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, one of the 24 books of the Bible. And if you read that literally, the whole story is a love story between a husband and wife, discussing the passion and the connection of that relationship. We know, though, through our tradition, that if it was incorporated into the Bible, it was much more than a love story. But it was a metaphor to the relationship that the Jewish people have with the creator of the universe. But the only metaphor that King Solomon could think of, the only thing that could come close to that kind of connection, would be that kind of relationship between husband and wife. That level of passion, that level of desire that could take place between man and woman, that's the only thing that we could ever use as a springboard to imagine that connection between the Jewish soul and the creator of the universe. I'll quote you one line from the Song of Songs. Hello. King Solomon writes that many waters will not be able to extinguish this love, and rivers will not wash it away. Nothing could ever sway, nothing could ever push us away from that ultimate love connection we have with the creator of the universe. And that took place at Mount Sinai. That's actually referred to in some of our literature as the wedding between God and the Jewish people. And what's very inspiring is that the same Torah that we have today, that Torah scroll that Moses received at Mount Sinai through his writing based on the dictation of God, is the same exact Torah scroll that we have here in Boca Raton, Florida, and it's the same one they have in Queens, New York, and Los Angeles, California, and Asia, and Europe, and Africa. All throughout the world, it's the same Torah scroll for over 3,300 years. Josephus, one of the great historians of all time, living about 1,000 years after the giving of the Torah, writes about the Jewish people. He says, during so many years as have already passed, no one has been so bold as to add anything to them, referring to the books of the Torah, or to take anything from them, or to make any change in them. This is also very unique. Any other text you'll find as a central text for any religion or philosophy of the world, anything that's older than 50 to 100 years, there's many different versions, many different, throughout the world, it looks very different. The Torah itself is the same Torah we had 33,000 years ago. When Moses came down, 40 days later, we know what happened. What did he see? He saw the Jewish nation and a golden calf. One of the more misunderstood parts of history. Once again, the movie was no help. Right? The movie had made it very clear, listen, we have to make a new God. So they make the golden calf and they worship the golden calf, and that was the new God. Now, why is that ridiculous? We're talking about a people, 3 million people, who personally eyewitnessed everything that took place in Egypt, like we spoke about last time. There was a year of the 10 plagues. Then they had the whole incredible experience by the Red Sea. And then to top it off, the climax of everything was going to Mount Sinai and having this experience where they all almost died. They were overwhelmed with the spiritual reality of what was going on. 40 days later, they're going to say, you know what? Let's try something else. Let's build a calf and worship that instead. Doesn't make too much sense. But I think the truth is when you read the Torah and you read what their claim was, what their fear was, we get somewhat of an insight as to what was really happening there. I quote, "For this man, Moshe, who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what became of him. Therefore, let's build a calf." Why does it say, "for this man, Moshe"? Just say, Moshe isn't here anymore. Oy vey, we don't know what happened. Maybe he got lost. Let's build a new God. But they were stressing the point, he's a human being, which we spoke about as being one of his greatest qualities, the fact that he was human, and the fact that everybody knew he was human. He didn't play any shtick. He wasn't pretending to be some kind of God or supernatural being. Everybody knew he was a man. But their fear was, if our leader is just a human being, who knows what's going to happen? Let's try to create a new leader, something that can help guide us, not to replace God, but to replace Moses. That was the idea of the golden calf. And this is a theme that I think also really comes out throughout history. There's a desire in the Jewish people. On one hand, we have such a respect, such admiration for our leaders, for our Torah personalities who we look up to and we ask questions from. And the more you learn from them, and the more you read their works, the more you realize their brilliance. I was in yeshiva in New York, and I studied altogether for about 14, 15 years, which is nothing, which is absolutely nothing. But during that time, you get a chance to read some of these people who really got it. They really knew what was going on. They had a mastery of the entire Torah, of the entire Mishnah and Talmud, which we'll get to, and everything that came afterwards. And with that mastery, they're able to put everything together and address any issue that would come up under the sun, no matter how contemporary the issue might be, because they had that clarity. And when you read their writing, you read their vision, you realize, wow, I'm nothing compared to this. And that's a beautiful thing, that we have this respect for our leaders. There's a fine balance, though, where if you take that respect, you take that admiration, and that somehow transforms into viewing them as somewhat supernatural, then that's very dangerous. For two reasons. Number one is, if I view you as more than human, so then you're bound to disappoint me. Because you're not supposed to make mistakes. But you do make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. The second danger is that we begin to feel it's not necessarily my connection with God. It's not about me and my relationship with the creator of the universe, but he'll do it for me. He'll be my middleman, my intermediary. That's not a Jewish idea. We believe that every man, woman, child has their own unique connection. And to ever have the perspective that someone else is going to do it for me, I can take the back seat, also very dangerous. Therefore, we have to have this fine balance, not to overdo it. We have a tradition that tells us that if we look at the prior generations and we view them as human beings, then we're donkeys. If we view them as angels, then we might be human. So it's a fine balance. On one hand, we have to respect prior generations. We have to respect our leaders and realize their brilliance and mastery. But at the same time, they're human beings and they could make mistakes. That was the mistake of this generation. They needed something more. That was the golden calf. Moses comes down, and we know, as soon as he sees this, what does he do? Smashes the tablets. You might say that's somewhat harsh. It's true, the kids are not behaving, and they're coloring on the walls, but why break the tablets? These are God-given. Do you know how much they're worth? Millions and millions of dollars. And the Talmud tells us, interestingly, Moses didn't consult God before he did this. This is one of the three things the Talmud says that Moses did without asking permission. And in each one of these three scenarios, God says, good job. Good choice. Yashar koyach. He did a beautiful thing. That's what the Talmud says. Why did Moses break the tablets? One idea, which is also a tremendous theme throughout Jewish history and leadership. So often we have a society, people who we as Jewish leaders or people trying to promote Jewish ideals, we want to impress on them certain ideas. We want to teach them, we want to uplift them, but many times we feel there's a certain resistance, as with anything in life. And for sure when it comes to religion and spirituality, there's always resistance. So you have one of two options. You could either kind of lower yourself down to their level. Okay, you don't want to join me over here, let me come to you and we could try to work things out. We could reform things a little bit, change things a little bit around, and we'll be okay. The other option would be, I can't compromise on our values. These are the values, these are the ideals given to us by God at Mount Sinai. I can't change these things. I have to learn how to adapt them, how to apply them to your scenario without change. One of the most fine, delicate balances we have throughout all of Jewish history. How to apply, how to make relevant Jewish concepts and ideals without changing them. But never to lower ourselves to the level of the masses, so to speak. And that's what Moses was displaying at that moment in time. If you can't handle this, if you can't live up to what God asks from you, then I'm smashing the tablets. Because I'm not going to lower myself to you. After that episode, we know that the goal was they would walk a couple days, be to the border of Israel, and cross into the land of Israel, the promised land. That would be that. And they did, almost. They got right there, and then the people came to Moses and said, we want to send in spies. Let them scout out the land, let them see how strong their army is, their forces, their military, just to make sure that we're able to do it. And Moses was not a fan of that idea, because he knew very well that God said, go into the land, you'll be successful. God has helped us until now, he'll continue to do so. But God told Moses, if they want to do this, don't squelch it. Let them do it. So he said, fine, if you want to go in, you can send spies. We'll send spies. And they sent 12 spies. They were there in the land for 40 days, scouting it out. They come back, 10 out of the 12 say, boys, let's go back to Egypt. It's not going to work. These people are huge, powerful, fortified cities. It's not going to work. 2 of them stood up, Joshua and Caleb, Yoshua and Caleb, and they said, what are you talking about? God has taken us this far. We've seen clear and open miracles up until this point, and we're going to see more clear and open miracles. Let's go into the promised land. Just like we said last time in regards to standing there by the raging sea. What was God's response? Go into the raging sea. You have to go forward right now. The people, however, were very, very concerned, and they cried. The Talmud tells us that date in Jewish history was the 9th of the month of Av. And as we will see throughout all of Jewish history, that has been a date of devastation, of destruction. And we'll see that as we go along, how that plays out century after century in so many different times, in so many different ways. But based on that, God said, this nation will not enter into the land of Israel right now. Rather, they need 40 years in the desert. 40 years where this whole generation, anybody above the age 20, will die out in the desert. And the new generation, all of those below 20, will enter into Israel. Now there's a very important idea in Jewish philosophy, which is, there's no such thing as punishment. There's no concept that God punishes in the Torah. Rather, the idea is cause and effect, which is a very different perspective. For example, if I take this and I let go, what would you say just happened? Well, because Rabbi Light let go of the pen, God punished him and made it fall to the ground. No, you would say there's something called gravity, and the way gravity works is when you let something go in midair, things go down. If I take my hand and I slap myself in the arm very hard, it's going to hurt. So do I say, I can't believe that because I chose to slap myself in the arm, my arm hurts. I guess God punished me. It's not a punishment, just cause and effect. That's true in the physical realm, it's true in the spiritual realm as well. There's no such thing as punishment. God is never there with a big whip. How can you do such an evil thing? Let me get you back. God doesn't get back. God created a system. He created a system, a reality, a structure that when we do certain things, there are certain consequences. And this is a perfect example. It wasn't a punishment because the people lacked faith and they didn't have the courage to go into the land of Israel. Therefore, I'm going to punish you to have to sit here for 40 years doing nothing. It's because they lacked faith, because they didn't have the courage. God said, you need 40 years. You need two things. You need, number one, this generation, they're not going to be the leaders. They can't be. Not a punishment, just a reality. They're not going to be good leaders going in from this state of living in the desert, leading you to the land of Israel. Number two, you need 40 years of training. And that's what the desert experience was. Why were they there for 40 years? Well, some say, well, Moses' wife kept on telling him, Moses, just ask for directions. He said, honey, trust me, I know what I'm doing. I'll get there soon. That's the wandering Jew. But the wandering Jew is very, very inaccurate. We weren't wandering. We knew exactly where we were going. We had direction from God every step of the way. There are many places where we were encamped for years. We weren't just wandering in the desert. The goal was a very intense training where there's 40 years where we have Moses, the ultimate teacher, we have the Torah, we have the oral Torah, and the goal is now let's sit and let's learn. That was the desert experience. It was a time of spirituality. It was a time of tremendous academic accomplishment. People don't realize that. They weren't just walking around in sandals. They were doing things very productive. Perhaps the idea of being the book of the nation of the book, the fact that it's so ingrained in every Jew that we're always searching wisdom, always wanting deeper levels of truth, that was the first collective experience where as a nation we came together for one purpose and one purpose only. Let's study. It's a very unique experience. They finally, though, after 40 years, the nation's ready, they've had their training, they've built up their courage, they built up their connection, they built up their knowledge, and they're about to go into the land of Israel. And as we know, Moses and Aaron died before that time. And Moses, in his last parting words, the entire 5th book of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, book number 5, is by and large the goodbye speech of Moses. It was inspiring the people. It was teaching them different things that were going to be applicable in the land. It was giving them the motivation and ultimately the insight they needed to make that transition in a smooth way. The transition was very difficult, though. You can imagine. You've been in the desert for 40 years. And during this time, you've been living pretty much a supernatural existence. It's been you and God. And you've been studying, and you've been growing, and you've been elevating yourself. And now, God says, okay, kids, out of the pool. You're going into the real world now, so to speak. And there were many changes. Number one was it was an entirely different mission. The mission up until now was learn, delve in, connect. There were different battles here and there, but by and large, it was an academic mission. Now the mission was, you have to fight. You're commanded to conquer the land. There's 7 nations here. This is the land that God promised to Abraham. You have to go in and conquer the land. Military, agriculture, very different mission. The second difference, which was also very difficult for them to get over, was in the desert they were very much a cohesive unit. They were together, they were one. Now they were going into the land of Israel. They would all divide into 12 different tribes and live in 12 different places. So communication was harder. To keep that achdus, to keep that oneness, was going to be a lot more difficult. The third issue was you're going into a land where there's a lot of different influences there. In the desert, all you have is you, sand, and God. You're going to a land now with 7 nations. And these nations, although very brutal, although very cruel, but there were also certain things in the culture that were somewhat exciting, somewhat glamorous. And therefore they had the challenge not to be influenced by all the different cultures, all the different peoples while going into the land. The fourth issue, which was perhaps the most profound, the most difficult to get over, was a change in leadership. Until now, it's been Moses. He's been the man, and although we've had tough times together, and we've had situations where we're screaming and we're crying and we can't take it anymore, but ultimately, he's been my father in a sense. He took us out of Egypt. He got us to where we are today, and now he has to go. And although we see that he gives the leadership mantle over to Joshua, the Talmud tells us that Moses was like the sun and Joshua was like the moon. He was a great man, Joshua, but he wasn't Moses. So we have to get adjusted to this whole new way of life, being thrust into the real world with a different leader. That was a very, very difficult transition. And you think about Joshua's role for a moment, that's got to be rough. Think of the President of the United States of America, whoever it's going to be. We'll see momentarily. It's a very difficult job. On one hand, you're the most powerful person on the face of the earth, which is great. On the other hand, you have many big decisions. In the case of Joshua, it wasn't just that he was taking over a leadership role. It was a whole different role. He had to help transition this nation of scholars, so to speak, and create warriors. Create warriors who would be able to fight, to be able to conquer the land, but at the same time, not lose their spirituality, not lose their scholarship. That's a very difficult challenge. When you think of great warriors, Moshe Dayan, you think of great military figures, you don't think of very high spiritual people. And when you think of spiritual people, you think of Gandhi, probably would not have been the best warrior. So to create this situation where you have this fine balance, I'm taking these, you think of boys learning in yeshiva. They're learning in yeshiva for many years, they're scrawny, they don't exercise, they're pale, and you bring them out, okay, fight the Iraqis. It's going to be hard to do. But that was the job that Joshua had. What is the idea of the promised land? What does that mean? Clearly, the land of Israel is very special. To the Jewish people, we have a very unique connection with that land. But what is that whole concept of having a land that's special? So there's an idea in Jewish thought that everything in the physical realm has a spiritual counterpart. Everything in this reality as we know it ultimately has a spiritual source. God made it clear to Abraham, hundreds of years before the entering into the land, that this land has a special energy that almost propels you to help bring close in your engagement in the Torah. This is a land that was destined for you. And it's hard to place it, it's hard to put your finger on it, but I myself had the experience going to Israel for the first time, that I walked off the plane, I was 13 years old, I knew nothing about Israel, but there was just something overwhelming about, I had an emotion that I was home. I've never been here before, but now I'm home. And speaking to people, I got the feeling that I was not unique in that. Many people have a similar feeling. But that's based on something very real, that there's something different, qualitatively different about this land, about the energy that's here, that's meant for the Jewish people, meant for us to keep the Torah in the most ideal, pristine fashion. The nations that were presently there, like we mentioned, the 7 nations, barbaric, primitive, cruel, murder, rape, offering children for sacrifices. Archaeologists found many, many piles of ashes with children and skeletons. This was their religion. This was their whole perspective on the world. It was something that was so ingrained. You can't go in there, you know what? We just want to teach you some of the other ways to look at life. In those days, in those situations, sometimes the only answer was what God told the Jews. You give them the following choice. You tell them, leave this land, this is our land, and go peacefully. If you don't leave, we're going to make you leave. But ultimately, you can't be here. This type of behavior can't take place on this type of kedusha, on this type of spirituality. The conquest began. They crossed the Jordan River in the year 2489 from the first human being, which on the secular calendar is about 1350 or so, right around here. They went into the land of Israel. People leading the way were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, That was the ark that Indiana Jones found later on in history. Right? That was the ark that the Torah tells us was where the tablets were placed. And they carried that with them, and they led the way into the land of Israel. There were 7 years of conquest, 7 years of moving forward, of fighting, and there were 7 years of distribution, 7 years of dividing up the land. But altogether, after 14 years, the land of Israel belonged to the Jews. The people of Israel are very compassionate. And as we spoke about in the very first lecture, that's part of the spiritual DNA passed down from Abraham. That's part of who we are. We like to give, we like to help, we like to be involved with chesed and kindness. But that makes following the directive of God very difficult when that directive is, make sure all the other nations are not here. Make sure these barbaric, primitive nations are not part of your soil. Don't let them stay here with you. Force them to leave. They had a hard time doing that. Because they were so compassionate, what happened was, although they conquered the land of Israel, there were many pockets where you had the Canaanites and you had Edomites who were still living in Israel. The end of Joshua's life, Joshua gives a quick recap of all Jewish history to make them aware of the significance of where they are right now and the importance of what they're doing by conquering the land and making it strong. And he says as follows, this is taken from the book of Joshua. And now, have an appreciation of the awareness of the Creator and perform the obligations of the Torah with wholeheartedness and truth. Remove the gods that your forefathers served before the times of Abraham or back in Egypt, and focus only on God. If it is difficult for you to serve God, then choose today whom you will serve. The gods of your forefathers, or the gods of the Amorite, in whose land you live. But as for me and my house, we will serve God. Now it's somewhat interesting. He seems to be saying to the people before he dies, you have a tremendous struggle ahead of you. You will be influenced by the nations around you. You will be involved in their idol worship and their culture. But I'm telling you right now, you have to make a choice. There's no way to live on the fence. The phrase in Germany, which we'll get to, was to be a Jew in the home and a German outside. Joshua was telling the people, this doesn't work. It might work with you for a moment, for a couple of years, but it's not going to work forever, and it's not going to work with your children. To give those kind of mixed messages. I'm a Jew over here, but then when we go to parties and we're involved with the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Gershuni and all the people that are there, we just like to be part of what they do as well, and we like to be part of their services. It is very, it's exciting. Joshua says you have one choice, make it now. For me, I'm serving God. And his concern, although at the time seemed somewhat way off, somewhat far-fetched, this was a nation who was not into idol worship. They had clarity. But Joshua's concern was based on the Torah. That in the Torah, God tells Moses, he says, this nation will arise, referring to the Jewish nation, once they get into the land of Israel, and go astray after foreign gods of the land into which they are coming. They will be influenced. Joshua was therefore saying, you got to stay strong. But after Joshua died, there was a golden age. There was a time where the Jews finally had the land, the promise of Abraham for hundreds of years that have been in the waiting and throughout the whole exile in Egypt, speaking about that time to come. They finally arrived, and here they were. They had control. They had their tribes throughout the entire land, but it only lasted for a short time. When Joshua died, there was no real leader. That began the age which was referred to as the age of the judges, of the Shoftim. Throughout the book of the Shoftim, the Judges, one of the 24 books of the Bible, it says that in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was proper in his own eyes. There was no real leadership as it was in the times of Moses, as it was in the times of Joshua. They had great people, the judges, who were prophets in their own right, who had spiritual power, who had physical prowess. Devorah, Gideon, Samson, some of these names we've heard of before, they were the leaders. But it wasn't the same thing as having one powerful, charismatic leader. This period lasted for almost 400 years. And it was a very turbulent period. There were lots of war with the Philistines. The time of security, the time of rest and peace was very few and far between. It was a rough time that lasted almost for 400 years. During those 400 years, the only books the Jews had in regards to their sacred books was the Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, which they brought with them, obviously. That before Moses' death, he gave one book of the Torah to each of the 12 tribes, and then placed one in the ark with the tablets. So they had the Torah, of course, and they had the book of Joshua. Joshua himself wrote down the book of Joshua as we have it in the Bible. Parts of it also written by Elazar and Pinchas, but the bulk was written by Joshua. So for the 400 years they were in the land of Israel, they had these 6 books pretty much. And that's what they learned from. That was their source of study. Until the times of Samuel. Samuel was in around the year 2885 from the first human being, which is 875 BCE. So right over here, we're definitely moving along, crawling along, but we're over here, 875 BCE. Samuel brought back the leadership that Moses had, that Joshua had. The Talmud tells us that Samuel was up there at the same level as Moses. He was almost as equal. Very powerful, wonderful prophet. And his greatness was that he was able to really reunite the Jewish nation. After 400 years of war and everyone living and doing their own thing, so to speak, he was able to bring them back together. However, his children didn't follow in his ways. Also a common theme. The greatest leaders of the Jewish people, many times their children just don't follow in their ways. And that's part of life. That's what the Torah is teaching us. Who were the children of Moses? Anybody know their names? Nobody knows their names. I know their names. It's actually in the Torah. But they didn't make it big. Because there's nothing to say just because Moses was a great man that his children are going to follow in his footsteps. They weren't the future leaders. It was Joshua. Joshua was not his child. And it's true as well in regards to Samuel. The prophet tells us, but his sons, who were also judges, did not follow in his ways. They swayed by profit. They took bribes and they perverted justice. So therefore the elders came to Samuel and they said as follows, and I quote, all the elders of Israel then gathered together and came to Samuel to Ramah. That was the place where they were. They said to him, you have grown old, and your sons did not follow your ways. So now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. That was the request. You were wonderful. You were able to bring back the leadership of Moses and Joshua, but your sons are not following in your ways, and we need a real leader. Please appoint a king like all the other nations. Now it's interesting, the response of Samuel was, he wasn't happy with this. Why wasn't he happy? The Torah itself, one of the 613 obligations in the Torah, is the Jewish people should have a king, a monarchy, which is something worthwhile to stop on, being the significance of the day, the election. What is the Jewish perspective? Democracy was not something the Torah speaks about. Not the Torah. Very clearly not a Torah ideal. Yet we look at the world and we've seen the Soviet Union, we see dictatorships, Iraq, Iran. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So then what exactly is the Torah's viewpoint? Is democracy the best possible system? So I think it's safe to say, in the world that we live in, it's the most productive system. My whole life I've been in California, I've been in New York, and for all the elections it's never so exciting. Because everyone knows California and New York, what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Florida though is exciting. It's the first time I'm actually in a state that it matters. What you vote for makes a difference. And there's lots of signs up and people are out there with their signs and it's a very exciting time. But yet I was very impressed You go down the streets here, and you see in front of one's house a sign for Romney, the next house Obama, Romney, Obama, but it's all good. I could fight you from today till tomorrow, going back and forth, why Romney is a complete fool, or why Obama is going to totally destroy Israel, whatever the conversation is. But I'm not going to rip down your sign. I'm not going to hurt you. That's the beauty of democracy. It's a beautiful system. And we have to every day say, thank you, God, for allowing us to live in a country with this type of understanding, this type of peace. But it's not perfect. It's not ideal. It's ideal in a non-ideal world. Why is it not ideal? Because it's based on the people. Do people really know what's best for them? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Now, if the other option is having a dictator telling me what's best for me, which is not really best for me, it's best for him, that's not an option. But if you have a structure where you have a king, a melech, and the way the Torah describes the king is a very, very different perspective than the other kings throughout the world. It's not about power, it's not about prestige. There's a special commandment given to the king that no matter where they go, they have to carry a small Torah scroll with them to keep them humble, to keep them with the recognition that you're not the real king. The real king is supernatural. You're just a servant of the king. And it wasn't just the king, it was the prophet as well. There is a system in the Torah where we have a king, but the king is not the end all and be all. There's a prophet, the spiritual leader, so to speak, and together you have a check and balance system. That the Torah feels is the ideal system. In our present world, in our present society, that can't happen. But why, though, the question is, why was Samuel upset when they approached him and said, we want a king? That's one of the instructors of the Torah. The answer is very interesting. The answer is he wasn't upset with the basic request. He was upset with why they asked for it. The actual verse says, so now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. That's what he was upset about. Like all the nations. You want this because everybody else has it? That's not what it means to be a Jew. The whole unique perspective of the Jewish nation is we are different. Avram Ivri, we come from the other side of the river. We do have a very different perspective on life. And it's okay to be different. And that's why ultimately we were redeemed from Egypt, because we dressed differently and we spoke differently. And that's a beautiful thing to be different. That's why he was upset. So although their intentions were not the ideal intentions, but it was the right thing to do at that time, and therefore he appointed King Saul. King Saul was the first Melech Yisrael, he was the first king of Israel, and with his appointing, with him becoming king, it really began a whole new dimension, a whole new period in Jewish history. Until then, whoever the leader was, in the times of Moses and Joshua, in the times of the Shoftim and the judges, the leader was always both the spiritual and the national leader, so to speak. He was one person. With this period of the kings, it was now divided. There was a separation, so to speak, between church and state. King Saul was the first king, but he wasn't necessarily the spiritual leader. The proof to this is Maimonides, which we'll get to soon. Maimonides writes, he has a whole train, a whole link tracing back his own family all the way back to King David, all the way back to Moses. And he basically sets forth the people who passed down the oral tradition. This tradition given to Moses, given to Joshua, the Jewish people had, who were the main players in that chain? So he lists Moses and Joshua and the elders, and he lists many of the judges. Samson was one of them. He wasn't just a strong, buff guy. He was a tremendous figure in the spiritual, intellectual realm as well. However, King Saul and King David, although very great people, they're not listed amongst the people who were links in the chain of passing down the oral Torah. That's a clear indication that at this point in history there was somewhat of a schism. We had the national leaders and we had the spiritual leaders, and it was no longer the same person. King Saul was tall and handsome and had a very deep voice. He was the perfect king. He was humble, he was modest, but he failed. He made the same mistake the Jews made when they first entered the land, which was he was too compassionate. There was obligation to defend themselves, to wipe out the Amalekim, the tribe of Amalek, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't bring himself to do it. And it was because of that misplaced mercy, so to speak, that one of the descendants of Amalek was actually Haman. So sometimes using that compassion, that natural Jewish trait, in the wrong way is not ideal. And therefore Samuel came to him and he said, because you have rejected the word of God, God has rejected you. Pretty harsh. But God doesn't mess around. If you're the king of the nation of Israel, you have to do what's right. You make a mistake, you're out. King David was then appointed. King David was the exact opposite. He was a leader that no one would have ever expected to be a leader. When Samuel came to his father, Ishai, he said, I'm here that one of your sons is going to be the next king of Israel. He said, oh, which one is it? David wasn't even on the radar. He was actually out with the sheep. He was a shepherd. Spoke about before. That was a quality of leadership that Moses had, that David has as well. And when he said it's David, it was a surprise to everybody. King David actually writes about himself in Psalms, one of the works that he authored. The stone the builders despised has become the cornerstone, referring to himself. So he was now chosen as the new king of Israel. His father was named Ishai. The Talmud tells us he was one of 4 people, only 4 people in history, never to sin. Who were the other 3? It was Ishai, number 1, the father of King David, Benjamin, one of the sons of Jacob, Amram, who was the father of Moses, and Kilov, who was the son of David. These 4 names ring a bell? Amram, Kilov. Sound familiar? Ishai. Weren't these the holiest people ever to walk the planet? They never sinned. Once again, though, we see an amazing Jewish principle. Not making a mistake doesn't make you the ultimate righteous person. The definition of what it means to be righteous, what it means to be accomplished, is not, I never make mistakes. I never say anything that's inappropriate. Because sometimes if you're never willing to risk, you never accomplish. The greatest accomplishment sometimes is by failing. King Solomon himself writes that the definition of a righteous man is Sheva Yichel Tzadik V'Kam. The righteous man will fall 7 times and get back up. That's what a righteous man is. Being able to fall and to fail and to pick yourself up and say, you know what, but I have to continue onwards. Ishai never sinned in his life, but we never heard of him before. He didn't make it big. David did make mistakes, but ultimately he was King David. He was the one that we have tradition that tells us the Messiah will come from his lineage because he was the great man. Time is getting late. Let's end 2 more minutes here in regards to King David's life. We're not going to get involved with the details. In general, it's a good thing to realize that a lot of what you hear about King David is not true. There's a tremendous misconception in regards to what he did with his life, the choices that he made, and most of it is inaccurate. The Talmud tells us that anyone who says that David was a sinner, Eino Ela Toa, he's making a mistake, you don't understand what really happened. King David was a very complex individual. On one hand, he was referred to as the Zmiras Yisrael, the passionate singer of the Jewish people. That's who he was. He was a passionate individual who would play his harp, who would rise to spiritual levels. The Talmud tells us he would wake up at the middle of the night and spend hours singing praises to God. He was at a lofty level. At the same time, he was a warrior. The story of David and Goliath. He was a fierce warrior. But he had that balance, the balance that Joshua was trying to create amongst all the Jewish people, being able to be strong and courageous, but at the same time, be a spiritual, elevated being. That's what King David was. His son was King Solomon, and King Solomon really inherited the kingdom at a time where everything was going beautifully. Through the strength of Samuel and King Saul and King David, who really brought the thing together, and King David made Jerusalem the capital. Now it was at its prime. And King Solomon was going to fulfill the mission of his father David. His father David had one dream, which was to build the temple that's spoken about in the Torah, the ideal resting place for God in this world, which we'll discuss more next time. He couldn't do it himself. But God said, through your son Solomon, you will be able to do it. And the last words that David spoke to Solomon was, David's days drew near to die, and he instructed his son Solomon, saying, I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong and become a man. Safeguard the instructions of the Creator, your God, to walk in his ways, to observe all of the obligations of the Torah. This is the only way you'll be successful. He knew his son was brilliant, and he was brilliant. King Solomon was known as the wisest of all men. But he also knew that sometimes being brilliant is a curse. And he told him, don't be too creative. I want you to realize that the only way you're going to keep this kingdom in its prime state is by trying to stay steadfast to the Torah. Use your creativity, use your brilliance, use your mastery to be an amazing leader, but don't stray from the Torah. We'll see next time what ended up happening with King Solomon and the whole experience of the first temple, which lasted 410 years. We'll continue next week. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
So how we doing?